Hi, welcome to the DRH show where I have wide-ranging conversations with fascinating people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. Today, I'm joined by the chair of Mankind Initiative. He was awarded an OBE in 2019 for his charity work in supporting male victims of domestic abuse. And he's the only person in the UK to ever do so. Mark Brooks, thanks for joining me.
Welcome, Dennis.
Yeah. It's great to have you here, Mark. So if you could just share to us your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Well, that's always an interesting question, Dennis. In terms of my involvement in the field of domestic abuse, I used to be a local elected councillor down in Bexley, which is the borough where I live in southeast London. And at the time, it's about 20 years ago, I was supporting a constituent who was a male victim of domestic abuse. And he was in a council house, he had a couple of children, and he was having real problems with the council in terms of actually them accepting that a man could be a victim of domestic abuse. So I then got interested in the subject. I then found the Mankind Initiative on the internet, and therefore just asked whether I could help. And nearly 15 years later, I'm still involved and still being the chair over that time. My other interests are in wider men and boys wellbeing issues, helped to co-found the Men and Boys Coalition charity. Also, I'm one of the leads on International Men's Day in the UK. And I suppose a side issue as well, I've stood for Parliament a number of times, including at the last general election. So quite an eclectic background, I would say.
You mentioned about the charities, the organizations that you work with. You have Mankind Initiative and also Men and Boys Coalition. I was just wondering, how do they actually complement their aim, or is it a different set of population that they're aiming to help?
Well, they're the same population. I mean, the Men and Boys Coalition charity and International Men's Day, which that charity looks after, it's really the whole gamut of male issues. So that's not just in the field of domestic abuse, but that comes through to men's health, mental health, education, employment, family, fatherhood, and all of the issues in between. So the Men and Boys Coalition is very broad based. Mankind Initiative just focuses on domestic abuse. So that's almost like a subset of the issues that the Men and Boys Coalition actually cover.
And like what you've alluded to earlier, Mark, you mentioned that what we often hear from the mainstream media is that it's the male who are actually perpetrators of domestic abuse. And based from your work within Mankind Initiative and Men and Boys Coalition, what are you actually doing to address this sort of stereotype? Because obviously it's kind of damaging to men's mental health if they're always framed as the perpetrators of domestic abuse.
Well, there's a number of things. I mean, and with regard to the charity, we work at 3 levels. And I think, Dennis, it'll be worth just going through those because they all contribute to answering the question you rightly posed. I mean, first of all, we provide practical support for male victims. So we run a helpline that receives around 2,500 calls every single year from men or people who are related to men. So we get lots of sisters and mothers, for example, calling us. And so that kind of support service is really important because it means that we're embedded in professional practice, so that when we talk to professionals and government, we're not talking to them on a theoretical basis, we're actually talking to them on an experienced basis. And I think that's really important in ensuring the credibility of our voice in many respects. Secondly, we provide an enabling function. And what I mean by that is that what we've done over the last 20 years as a charity, and it was part of when I became chair, it was part of the kind of strategic thinking that we did at the time, was that we've been really keen to grow the number of male victim services available in the UK, and also to make sure that support from associated services like the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, local health service, local councils, for example, when it comes to male victims, is really, really good. So what we've done is to lobby and argue to make sure that there is a service for male victims in every single town, county or city in the UK, but also then help organisations to actually create those services. And we've trained police forces, local councils, housing departments, the armed forces, right across the board, other charities, to actually make sure that in their role in supporting domestic abuse victims, they really understand the barriers on that male victims have, and also how to better support them. And then that goes all kind of 360 into the other area, which is being a voice for male victims. And so one of the things that we've done for the last 15 years is really be part of government stakeholders. So we're talking and lobbying the government all of the time in different government departments to make sure that everything that they do is male victim friendly. We're often in the media as well, making that point. And lastly, really pushing back on this whole notion that domestic abuse is a gendered crime, that it's basically caused by theories such as the patriarchy and other kind of ideological views around domestic abuse, because our view is domestic abuse is a crime. It has gender nuances because it affects men and women broadly in different ways on some aspects, but not all. The vast majority of issues that a female victim face are exactly the same that a male victim faces. And so we challenge the view that domestic abuse is a gendered crime. It isn't. It's a crime that affects people from different genders differently in some circumstances. And also, I would say that our view is very much 21st century. Is very much steeped in where we are as a society, which is about reflecting and respecting diversity and inclusion and equality. And we feel that, you know, those that talk about domestic abuse as being really a crime only really perpetrated by men on women, and it's part of some ideological Marxist construct of society, we feel that they're very much 20th century and out of touch with the reality of domestic abuse. Even more so when you have to look at intersectionalities, for example, obviously LGBT plus victims, but also victims who are from the BAME community, disabled, people with disabilities, different ages. So I think that kind of one-dimensional view of domestic abuse is really not relevant to society in Britain today.
Absolutely. And actually, what you're actually doing, not just with Men and Boys Coalition, but also with Mankind Initiative, this actually reflects with your work as an equalities advisor. Like what you've said, this is actually a gendered issue. But I think what makes it, people see it not as a gendered issue is because what we're actually hearing from the media, and especially that you mentioned something, intersectionality, and because we also see men, especially white men, as, you know, like the dominant force. So we don't see, the dominant individual. So that's why sometimes we don't see it as a gendered issue, but sometimes we see it as a power struggle. In relation to that, I just want to hear your thoughts. Because I was reading the Telegraph yesterday, and there was an interesting article written by Anita Singh. It says that there's a rise in men who feel that the BBC is no longer reflects people like me, and it's in reference to, you know, working class men, working class white men. They don't feel that they're being represented within the mainstream media. Mark, within your line of work, within as chair of organizations and also as chair of Mankind Initiative and as equalities advisor, would you say that this is sort of the reality that men experience, especially while working class men, that they don't feel welcome within the society?
I think that is a growing problem, and I mean, part of it is because of the acceleration of identity politics, and the issue is that you have to look at the individual comes first. I mean, not only is that part of Britain, part of the British Constitution, albeit unwritten, part of human rights legislation, and just is morally the right way to think, is that individuals come first, and their protected characteristics, whether that's their race or gender, sexuality, age, etc., are important aspects of being an individual, but they don't override the fact that everybody is an individual, and their individual identity is what should always trump any ideology or any identity politics. And the problem has been in that way the society, and especially the political narrative, because it's not society in general. You know, there's often this, the whole point is that society is not Twitter, and people get cancelled, or people are worried about engaging on Twitter, or the backlash that people get on, but not everybody's on Twitter. And I think that that's sometimes the importance of Twitter and other things can be stressed too highly. So I think the issue is around identity politics, and what that's meant is that in the hierarchy, in the identity politicians and politics world, is that white men are always at the very top, and that means that every single white man is actually has more privilege and more power than anybody else on that pyramid. And that creates a problem, because you start to not look at what an individual's need is. You actually just make assumptions about where people are in that pyramid because of the identity group that they are in. And we've got to move away from that. And as I said, it's really weird with society. We talk so much about respecting diversity and equality, etc., but actually it's only dependent on where you are on that pyramid. And one of the key things, you know, I always say is that, yeah, there are more white male billionaires in the UK, but there's a number of billionaires who aren't white male, but also they're at the bottom of the pyramid in many men are. So basically you'll find that the majority of rough sleepers are white men. Who's coming worse off at schools, in terms of educational achievement, is white boys, for example. So therefore, this kind of identity politics, this kind of privilege pyramid, really does a disservice to actually our country, and also looking at individual needs. And when I'm coming back to your question, therefore, Dennis, is the fact that that's why a lot of men, for example, feel perhaps that the BBC and other cultural institutions aren't talking about them or reflecting on them, because those cultural institutions are actually playing, are based on identity politics, and therefore their whole basis means that it isn't about you as an individual; it's about where you are on this identity pyramid. And a good example I've used before is that, you know, often there's a lot of campaigning about wanting to get more women in boardrooms in the city, etc. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But the issue is about, well, are the women who are then going into the boardroom at that level, if they're all private school, you know, you can't say, for example, that they are less privileged than a white or black working class kid from a council estate, in that the chances of that white or black boy, for example, of getting on the board of a FTSE 100 company who lives in a council estate in the inner city, they've got far less chance of that happening than a white upper middle class woman who went to private school, and her father is a stockbroker and her mum's a barrister. But the identity politics suggests that the white and the black boy from the council estate are more likely to get on the board, and we know that's just not true. And that's why identity politics is really not helpful at all.
Absolutely. Now, Mark, I'm going to mention to you some statistics which I suppose you're already familiar with. Research shows that 1 in every 12 men in the UK are suffering from a mental health disorder, and suicide remains the biggest cause of death for men under 35. And research also demonstrates that that's because men often don't talk about mental health. Now, we've already heard of the research a number of times, especially if you're working within the mental health sector. But based from your work and from your experience, could you also identify some reasons why men won't talk about their mental health?
Well, I'll be honest on that question, Dennis. I mean, men do talk about their mental health, but they just do it in a different way to perhaps women do. You know, I'm not an expert in female mental health, so you know, I'll leave that to others. But I think it's a cop out to keep saying, well, men, you know, you should talk more. It's your fault that you don't talk about your mental health. Because I heard a really good talk from a mental health campaigner, Natasha Devon, recently, and she was saying, well, that's just victim blaming. And the fact that you're putting all the emphasis on men to be the ones talking. What we should be doing is, first of all, recognizing that men do talk, but they do in a different way. They don't do it often directly. They often do it with standing shoulder to shoulder, which is a great line and catchphrase used by the UK men's shed movement. And that they do it in a way that makes them feel comfortable. And also safe in terms of worrying about any shame or stigma or actually people questioning how manly they are. But men do talk. The issue is two things: who is listening and who is taking action. And there's been research recently. Calm and others undertook some research that said that, you know, a large number of the men who took their own lives over the last couple of years had actually been in the system. It's been that they've been accessing mental health, or they disclosed, or they'd spoken to GPs and others. So basically, men do talk, but who is listening? The other issue about victim blaming, which I always like to think about, is that it's used as a cop out, because what we want from our public services is that to remember that they're there to actually serve the people that fund them, which is society and taxpayers, etc. But so it's their responsibility to become more closer to men, to be more male victim or male friendly, not only in things like opening hours, but also in their communications, being more direct, and also wanting to make sure that men that know that their services are very much out there for them, including, you know, thinking about how men access services. So a lot of men, if they're worried about being taken seriously, will access a lot of information on websites, for example, rather than perhaps having to disclose some form of weakness in their character or some form of health problem. So I think that the emphasis should be on public services to bring themselves closer to men. And that's why you see great initiatives. You know, I talk about UK Men's Shed, you've got the Lions Barber Collective, you've got Andy Man Sheds, you've got a huge number of helplines and others out there supporting men in all sorts of shapes and forms. And they're often set up by men and women who actually are working outside the public services, because basically it's so difficult to get public services to be male friendly. So men do talk. The emphasis is on society and public services to listen.
Absolutely. And I think what we can also take from here is that researchers and also psychotherapists, they need to develop more customized approach that will, you know, be more attractive to men to engage in, psychological therapies and psychological interventions. And I have to mention, aside from what those organizations that you mentioned, such as Barbers Collective, for instance, the male psychology section of the British Psychological Society, they're doing important work in comes to, researching what would be an effective intervention program for men. Now, Mark, I want to explore more about your work. And I'm just wondering if because gay men are a subgroup who are vulnerable to depression and suicide. You mentioned earlier that you're doing a lot of work in relation to diversity. So does supporting gay men also falls within the remit of your work, or is it, something else that you're doing?
It does in terms of in terms of number of things. I mean, in terms of the Men and Boys Coalition charity, obviously that covers gay men as well. All of the everything we're doing, covers gay men, and certainly some of the work that we've been doing, specifically through Mankind Initiative, but also through the coalition charity around domestic abuse and a whole range of other crimes, obviously affect men in same-sex relationships as well. I mean, our helpline, we do support men who are in same-sex relationships, but we also do signpost them on to Gallup, which is a specialist organisation that helps LGBT plus victims of domestic abuse. So we do work with them. We know that there's a lot of research that's coming out quite soon from Dr. Ben Hine with regard to gay men and domestic abuse, and that will show some differences in, say, men who aren't who are in a heterosexual relationship, in terms of issues around their coping mechanisms. So that will be really, really important research when that comes out. The key thing for us, though, is about, again, this kind of narrative, though, this inclusive narrative, because I come back to, when you talk about a whole host of crimes as gendered crimes, you're not only excluding men who are victims of those crimes, which includes heterosexual men in same-sex relationships, and obviously people non-binary, but also often you're excluding women in same-sex relationships as well. So when you describe domestic abuse as a gendered crime and it's a result of women's place in the world, you're not talking about women in same-sex relationships either. So they very much are as excluded as men are in the narrative in areas such as domestic abuse or sexual violence.
Now, Mark, there are also challenges that makes the mental health of men even more worse. Say, for instance, that the challenges of being a new father or separated from their children, and also, of course, there's specific, mental medical conditions such as prostate cancer. So I was just interested about how you are actually addressing this sorts of concern for men.
Well, I think at a individual level, number of the charities I'm involved in will be supporting the other charities. So, for example, the Men and Boys Coalition and others will be supporting brilliant charities like Prostate Cancer UK, for example. Also charities like Families Need Fathers. And I think what's been important in the men and boys wellbeing sector, in terms of the charity sector, is the number of organizations that really are specialists in certain fields and also coming together to actually collaborate. And I think that's really important in terms of the work, in that making sure that all of those great organizations not only are financially stable, because they need to be able to fund the services that they provide, but also work collectively to change this narrative that basically is basically men are problems, women have problems, and that men, in terms of their well-being, somehow should not be seen as being equal to supporting the needs of needs the well-being of women and girls. And so I think a lot of the work needs to be challenging that narrative, but not in a immature way, because the key thing is that we live in a society and we're all interconnected. And the issue is that anybody who supports men and boys' well-being, by their very nature, should be supporting the well-being of women and girls, and vice versa. So even though organizations and people like me are focused on men and boys, it's not at the cost of women and girls. And one of the things I've been very careful to do within the field of domestic abuse is always to talk about, we want more funding and support and recognition for male victims, but also we want the same for female victims too. And we don't want to see resources taken away from female victims or women in need and given to men. We want more for all. So I think it's really important that we don't fall into the trap of basically coming across or even advocating for support to be taken away from women and girls. And the last point, I suppose, on this, Dennis, if I may, is around the importance of women and girls in men and boys' well-being. Because I talked about a number of women who called our helpline because they're worried about a man in their life. On International Men's Day, probably the biggest supporters of International Men's Day, especially in the UK, which is probably the most popular country in terms of where it's celebrated. I mean, last year we had over 200 events taking place, biggest trend on Twitter for 14 hours. Even the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, tweeted about how important International Men's Day and men's mental health was. But the majority, actually, of a lot of these events are actually run by women, set up by women. And so, there's a lot of talk nowadays about allies and allyship, and basically making sure that we've got women on board to support the well-being of men and boys, and their psychology is absolutely important. And we know, the Centre for Male Psychology and the British Psychology Network for Men, for example, has got lots and lots of women involved, and lots of the charities that we're involved in are led by women. And I mean, Prostate Cancer UK, which is probably the biggest men's charity in the UK, their chief executives are women. So I think it's really important for us to make sure that not only are we fighting for inclusion, but also we talk and we act in a very inclusive manner too.
Absolutely. And as you've clearly highlighted, this is really a collaborative work. It's not just, a group of men who are, espousing or promoting men's dominance, but it's really looking after everyone's mental health, not just for men, but also for women. As you've clearly said, women are actually supporting it, and I can speak for the male psychology section of the British Psychological Society, because I'm a member of that, and a chair is actually a woman, and like what you've said, women are actually part of this, campaign. Just to follow up my question about what exactly you're doing with your organizations, because another thing, just the other day, I was speaking to a forensic psychiatrist. So, Mark, I was wondering if you also carry out work relating to men's mental health in prison. And I think this is an important aspect that we have to touch upon, because statistics also show that a large percentage of the prison population are actually men.
In terms of the work that I or the charities that I'm involved in, no, we don't work directly with men in prison. Mainly because other people are doing that, and it's just not our field of expertise. But certainly we know that really good work's being done by colleagues who are part of the Men and Boys Coalition, Survivors Manchester, which is a sexual violence charity based in, obviously, Manchester, led by a wonderful chap, Duncan Craig. And I know they're doing a lot of work in charities in and around Manchester and Lancashire. And so certainly they're looking at how the importance of mental health for men who are in prison. And we know some of the work, great psychologist Naomi Murphy, for example, talks a lot about the fact that so many men who are actually in prison have got adverse childhood experiences, and that they're the issues that have impacted on why they've committed crimes, which is why they're in prison. But also this kind of different take about for women who go into prison, there must be some other reasons, emotional or background issues that have caused them to go into criminality. But that kind of isn't really part of the narrative when it comes to men who are in prison. It's just seen as something that's innately behavioural and a problem to do with masculinity. So again, even in terms of prison populations, there's a different lens that's applied to women in prison than one that's applied to men. And broadly speaking, it's not it's not down to some sort of societal backgrounds that are causing men to be in prison, when the research and work of people like Naomi actually clearly show that is a big factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned about Naomi Murphy. I'll just plug my last interview. I've actually spoken to Naomi Murphy and David Jones about a week ago. So for anyone who's listening and wants to learn more about their work, like what Mark said, you can watch some of my previous episodes. Moving on, I just want to hear from you, Mark. What about racial and ethnic disparities in men's use of mental health? Obviously, race and ethnicity are a big aspect of anyone's work within mental health. So how are you sort of addressing this with Mankind Initiative and Men and Boys Coalition?
Well, I think with the charity, the Mankind Initiative, I mean, our big thing is again changing the narrative, really, Dennis. I mean, a good thing, for example, is that not a good thing, but one of the areas we're looking at, trying to change the narrative around forced marriage and so-called honour-based violence. So, for example, 1 in 5 of victims of forced marriage are actually men, and some of those men are gay men as well. But then, if the narrative is on forced marriage is only about women, then the impact on the mental health of those men who are victims of forced marriage is that it reinforces that they're alone, that there's something that means they're probably to blame, and also that they feel that they're not going to be taken seriously, that there's no support out there for them, and therefore they're just stuck in the position that they're in, and they're just going to have to suffer from it. And all of those factors, this kind of feeling of alone, the narrative, the lack of services, never hearing about male victims of forced marriage, for example, does play into the psychology of those male victims, because it means that there's an additional barrier for them not only recognizing what's going on, but also knowing that they can escape from the situation. And of course, that really emphasizes their feelings of being trapped. Also, the perpetrators, and this is the same in domestic abuse and other related fields, is that there's the use of masculinity against a man actually is used by abusers to trap them. So often, a female abuser, say, for example, in a domestic abuse situation, but similar family abuse, especially around forced marriage, is that, well, you're a man, no one's going to believe you. Everybody knows it doesn't happen to men. Or if you tell anybody you're a victim, I will just say to the police or the GP or whatever, that's impossible. Everyone knows I'm the victim and he's just pretending. And so all of those factors, the narrative and using masculinity against men, actually impacts on the male psychology of victims. It traps them even more. So it kind of uses identity politics, and also the narrative about, as I said, men are problems, only women have problems, really acts on the male psychology to trap them even further. I mean, it is a tactic that we've seen a number of times where people have actually used psychology to actually trap men in the situation, but also make it even worse.
Now, you mentioned that masculinity is actually framed as something negative, and I'm quite sure that with your line of work, you've heard of the phrase toxic masculinity. So I was just want to hear from you if that phrase is actually a condemnation of manhood, and also what would you characterize as a healthy and acceptable form of masculinity?
Well, first of all, I mean, I've said it before that the only thing toxic about toxic masculinity are those who use it to demonize a whole gender. I mean, it's a deliberate phrase to actually minimize men and boys' well-being, and also to actually basically, it's a victim blaming phrase. There's nothing inherently toxic about masculinity, in the same way that there's nothing inherently toxic about femininity. There's toxic men and there's toxic women, but the in masculinity and femininity isn't inherently toxic. And the thing is that while I'm always concerned about it, A, it's victim blaming. B, it basically demonizes a whole gender based on the behavior of a few, because the kind of difference between sort of men and masculinity is kind of, the phrase masculinity is really used to demonize men. And then also it gives an excuse and a cop out again, and I've talked about it with public services and society in general, to basically turn a blind eye, continue to turn a blind eye to men and boys' well-being, and also their cries for help and needs for support. And lastly, it's actually a dangerous term. It puts men and boys more at risk, because if you're a man and who's feeling suicidal, who's got big problems, financial problems, relationship problems, health problems, if you keep hearing the phrase toxic masculinity, actually it's going to make it less likely that you're going to actually seek any help, because you'll start to think, again, it comes down to the psychology of the phrase, the psychological impact on the phrase on vulnerable men and boys. It basically reinforces that there's something inherently wrong with them as an individual, and also inherently something wrong with their sex or gender. And that makes it less likely that they're actually going to reach out and get any help. So my view is toxic masculinity, the phrase, is dangerous, and it actually exacerbates risk in vulnerable men and boys.
So for you, what would be a healthy masculinity?
Well, I mean, a healthy masculinity is basically where I suppose. I mean, it's a good question, actually. It's not, I'll be honest, it's not something I've really thought too much about. But a healthy masculinity, I think, is the same with healthy femininity. It's about respect for colleagues, friends, family, society in general. It's also always wanting to make a positive difference, doing the right thing for yourself, but also for those that you interact with. And in terms of doing everything like that in a ethical and morally good way, so looking out for people, looking out for yourself, looking out for people, and just behaving in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely. Or actually, we could also say that, being resilient, I think that would be a good aspect of healthy masculinity. Now, Mark,
Yeah.
of course, you run charities, you run organizations. Now, a lot of this actually is funding dependent. So, if funding is not an issue, what services you would like to be offered to men up and down the country?
Well, if funding wasn't an issue, I mean, the key thing is that what I would want to see is a number of things. I mean, it's certainly clear that we need, in terms of men's health, we need a men's health strategy, but also the men's health strategy has to be right. I mean, we've got a female health strategy that the government are consulting on. Well, there needs to be a men's health one too, especially to tackle particular issues about, obviously, obesity, drink, drugs, but also in terms of actual mental health, and making sure that there's services and support for men who are suffering from those issues, but also, more importantly, in some respects, understanding why men end up in those situations. So I think having a clear men's health strategy, which is implemented across the UK, is really, really important. In terms of boys' education, in particular area that I'm interested in, again, making sure that we have particular schemes. There's a great scheme called Lads Needs Dads in Essex, for example, which really is looking at boys without fathers or positive role models in in their household. And I'd like to see schemes like that actually rolled out across the UK, including boys mentoring and also boys reading clubs as well. So they're things that I'd really, really want to see. Other things is basically the services which are already there actually be funded far better than they actually are, and be more well publicised. So money no object, men's health strategy, certainly more services around domestic abuse and sexual violence, but also a lot more emphasis and support for boys with regard to education. That is an area that really, really has to be tackled, because again, a lot of the psychologists that are working in boys' education, they really do talk about boys being falling behind than girls, so they become despondent. Also, kind of the psychological, the environment of schools. I mean, how boy friendly they are, even more so when there's more female teachers now, really do dominate the teaching profession. And therefore, those kind of psychological aspects on young boys growing up are areas that really need to be tackled.
Absolutely. Now, I just want to go back to what you said earlier, because you've said that a lot of women are actually engaged in promoting positive mental health for men. But also, we can't deny the fact that a lot of women, especially those on the feminist side, that they're actually trying to demonize men. So, Mark, what do you think we can do to help women create a more positive conversation about masculinity, and what sort of mental health services that would work for men, that could also benefit that could also benefit women?
Well, I think the, the argument. I mean, what I would say is that those who try and demonize men don't talk for 95% of women in our society. I'm talking about the women who love their husbands or boyfriends and partners and brothers and brothers and fathers and their male work colleagues and their male friends. I mean, those that try and demonize men don't talk up, don't talk for 95% of women, if not, I'd even say 99% of women, in the UK. They just don't. And so it's a particular group, but a lot of them dominate the charity sector, or they dominate the media, and dominate the political narrative, and that's one of the issues. So I think, a lot of us, we hear about it all the time, but they don't speak up for normal women. I mean, they don't, and normal women are actually very clear that these that these don't talk up for them. So I think that that's important. I think the second area again is the fact that it's making sure that that those views are challenged, and often the best advocates for challenging those views again are women, and that's why it's really important. You talk about the male psychology section. Half of our trustees at the charity are women. There's a huge amount of female academics, psychologists, and others who are actually focusing on men and boys' well-being, and they are the best, the most powerful people to challenge that narrative. Not only because their views are very sound and right, but also it also makes it more difficult for that those that want to demonize men to argue against a woman who is saying, no, we need to support men. People like, as I said, Natasha Devon's wonderful, Dr. Elizabeth Bates, Naomi, and others that you've mentioned, who are basically just want to see an inclusive society, and they want to argue and support men as much as they do women.
Absolutely. Now, Mark, we're already nearing towards the end of this interview, and we've learned a lot about your important work with Mankind Initiative and Men and Boys Coalition. Now, for the last questions that I've prepared for you, we just want to hear the human side of Mark. So I just want to hear who inspires you both professionally and personally.
I would say it's probably my dad, certainly. Uh, Certainly a white van man, recently retired as well. Certainly he inspires me in terms of actually not always, but in terms of always challenging the narrative. He was always argumentative, but not in a aggressive way, but in a where basically always not always believe in what you're told and actually thinking and challenging things for yourself. So I think on that basis, certainly personally, in terms of professionally, I mean, it's probably a weird answer, but I think again, someone like Margaret Thatcher, actually. I mentioned my political background. It may not be the most popular answer you've ever had, Dennis. But again, I think from a professional basis, it's just the fact that people like her and others, to be honest, who have challenged the establishment, who have basically seen that something is not right in the world, in the way the world is actually going, and has actually said, no, I want to actually change this. And I don't want to actually just accept the status quo. So it's people who are ba- basically people who are a little bit rebellious in the right way. And certainly, I suppose when I was growing up in the 80s as a teenager, from a white working class background, where you'd always been told, especially coming out of the 70s, that you should know your place in society. I think that when people like her came along, that was really important for me on a kind of personal and professional background, because the reason that's been inspiring is because a lot of the work that I've been doing is obviously been trying to challenge the status quo.
Mark, absolutely. Choosing Margaret Thatcher, I think that was a bit unexpected. I think that was a good choice. Now, how do you relax? What's your distressing outlet?
How do I relax?
Mhm.
Well, two areas. I mean, Cholton Athletic, which is obviously if you see on the top, I've got a number of Cholton books. So that's my local football team in Southeast London. Although I wouldn't say that that's actually not stressful supporting Cholton. I think also music, very much into sort of loud indie type music, The Cure, Depeche Mode, for example, really happy bands like that, and the Smiths, but also going out with my lovely wife. Uh, at the weekends, which is always good. And I have to bribe her with a curry every Saturday because of the amount of time I'm doing other things. And also, I go out walking with my school friends. So we've been friends for over 40 years now, and we've been doing walking for the last probably about 7 years now. We walked the North Downs Way a couple of years back, and now we're nearly at the end. We're walking from Tower Bridge all the way along the Thames Estuary, around the Isle of Sheppey, and then walking all around the Kent coast. And our aim is to get to Hastings, and we've only got a couple of walks left, and they're about 10 to 12 miles every Saturday, and we do that probably about once every six weeks. We go out on a Saturday, so that's what I do to relax.
Yes, and of course, with the amount of work that you're doing for men's mental health, you definitely deserve some distressing outlet. Now, Mark, what do you think you would be doing if you didn't work as a campaigner?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, Dennis, I was been trying to get elected to Parliament for some time now, but obviously that would mean if I got elected, I'd be a campaigner. I'll be honest, I've no idea at all. I'd like to have been a musician, but the bands that I was in, they always ended up falling apart just as we were getting really good. So yeah, I'd like to have been a musician.
And finally, what else is in the pipeline? If people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at? And again, remind us again of the organizations that you work with.
Well, if you wanted to contact me, you can go. I've got a website actually, which is mark-brooks.co.uk. It's got lots of activities that I'm doing there, and of course on LinkedIn, but also via the two main charities. Mankind Initiative charity, domestic abuse, the Men and Boys Coalition charity that oversees all of the men and boys wellbeing issues, and also of course International Men's Day UK. It's got a great website, and I'd really appreciate anybody listening watching this to think about what they can do for International Men's Day on the 19th of November. Lots and lots of academics and campaigners hold events, lectures about male psychology in their universities, etc. So it'd be great if more and more psychologists were doing things like that for International Men's Day. Over 200 events every single year. It'd be great if we can get to 300, and it's a great hook and opportunity to talk about male psychology, either on that day or in the days before or after. So please make use of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'll do is I'll put all those links on the video description notes. So anyone who wants to follow your work, and also for anyone who wants to get involved with International Men's Day, and it really sounds like a relevant and important event, they can get in touch with you directly. Mark Brooks, it's a pleasure having you here on the DRH show, but unfortunately our time is up. I look forward to hearing more about your work.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much indeed.